From promises of a golden era of peace and promotion of tolerance to violence in the streets and the looming threat of communism, the 1960s saw a paradigm shift in the ideals and values of the American people. On June 20th, 1969, at 10:56 p.m. EDT, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin were the first two people to walk on the surface of the moon, officially ending the space race. This was the culmination of the 10 previous Apollo missions in a concerted effort by the United States to reach the moon by the end of the century. A declaration made by President Kennedy only 8 years prior to May 26, 1961, reads,
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win."
This speech did not come out of nowhere, but due to the multiple humiliations at the hands of the CCCP's space program and its constant lead in the field of space exploration. The Soviets were the first to launch a satellite and the first to send a man around the Earth in low orbit. To fix this bad image, Kennedy consulted with NASA's own James Webb, the administrator of the soon-to-be Apollo program, who concluded that, with sufficient funds, the prospect of landing on the moon by the turn of the century was well within the realm of possibility. In the end, the challenge of landing on the moon was not the challenge of science it claimed to be, but rather a direct response to communist success. But what was happening on Earth? Perhaps one of the most memorable groups to this day, the Beatles, was an English rock band formed in 1960. The members consisted of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They were the most popular band of the 20th century. Their name was recognizable anywhere, and their songs were always on the radio. They first formed in Liverpool and had their first studio contract in 1962. Sometimes known as Beatlemania, people loved the Beatles so much, almost to the point of being obsessed. At first, the Beatles performed for small yet compassionate audiences, but by the time the band really started to take off, the post-World War II baby boomers were approaching their teen years. The economy was very prosperous, and the happy and upbeat tunes that the Beatles had were very fitting for the time. The majority of people listened to the Beatles, and the people who didn't still knew who they were. They swept the nation and became popular, not only in England, but worldwide. The Beatles were, and always will be, a worldwide phenomenon. The media and culture of the 1960s represented the shifting values of the American public as well. In 1962, Stan Lee introduced a new generation of superheroes who struggled with the problems of the common man. The trailblazer in this genre was Spider-Man, who refreshed the palette of comic book readers with his relatable problems. As the civil rights movement started to make big strides and America took to the stars, Gene Roddenberry's record-breaking show, Star Trek, debuted in 1966. The show promoted tolerance, featured diversity, and pushed many boundaries, including broadcasting the first scripted interracial kiss on American television. The adventures of the USS Enterprise provided some relief in the time of the Cold War tensions, and Nichelle Nichols' portrayal of Lieutenant Uhura was praised by Martin Luther King Jr. for showing African Americans what they really can do. In 1969, Joe Gans Cooney's educational show Sesame Street hit the small screen. Featuring colorful characters and short educational segments, the show was created in part to teach underprivileged children important lessons about numbers, the alphabet, and important social issues in order to prepare them for kindergarten. It has served as a vehicle to promote equality through its cast of diverse characters, and today it is viewed in more than 120 countries and has been seen by over 74 million Americans. In a crazy time of revolution, the visual media of the 1960s offered a hopeful note for the future, as well as promoting equality and equity across the nation.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its
This iconic line was delivered by Martin Luther King in 1963 during the March on Washington and is debatably one of the most well-known and defining moments of the 60s. The hundreds of protests throughout the 60s have had immense effects on modern-day America, and as one historian put it, the 1960s protests shook the very foundation of U.S. civil society. The era began with the use of protests during the Civil Rights Movement to address racism and the denial of constitutional rights to African Americans. This organized resistance to discrimination through thousands of Americans' participation in protests and marches would lead to landmark pieces of legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Protests didn't stop once the Civil Rights Movement cooled down during the mid-60s, as the Chicano women and students movement began to heat up as people all over the nation began to realize that binding together could change the world. However, politics were quite tight abroad. The year is 1961, and the United States was struggling with the brand new arm of an old enemy. That enemy was the USSR, and the new arm was Cuba. Cuba was led by the dairy-loving dictator Fidel Castro, who had come to power just 3 years before. Castro allied himself with the USSR, and the United States responded to the threat by launching the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion on the beaches of Cuba. The invading soldiers were members of the Brigade 2506, a group of exiled Cuban counter-revolutionaries tasked with the landing of the Bay of Pigs and destabilizing the Cuban government to overthrow Castro. The soldiers of Brigade 2506 were defeated within 2 days by Castro's military. The failed operation strengthened Castro's regime and paved the way for an event that would occur about 1 year later. That event was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet government placed ballistic missiles in various locations on the island of Cuba. This was partially in response to two events: the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the placement of similar missiles in Turkey by the United States. President John F. Kennedy responded to this threat by implementing a naval blockade on Cuba to prevent the further importation of nuclear warheads. In an attempt to quell the danger, the current leader of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, and JFK made attempts to communicate and find a common ground to quell the tension. Eventually, both sides met an agreement. Among other things, Khrushchev would pull the missiles out of Cuba, and the United States would refrain from invading Cuba again. In terms of the art itself, our mural is set on Sesame Street, and each of the components we've spoken about today have been included. Originally inspired by a Where's Waldo theme, each event can be seen symbolically throughout all parts of the mural. Though some of the main components the audience should look for are the moon, Fidel's Creamery, the lamppost, Spider-Man, and protesters on the streets. Because we wanted to have the moon in the background, our mural is set at night, so most of the colors are dark. However, we chose to draw attraction to the storefronts by using bright blues, reds, and greens. One of the most unique aspects of our mural is the perspective, because the audience looks down the street rather than just straight at it. We first drew our design by hand on paper and then replicated the design in Google Slides to make it easier to trace. Thank you for listening to an explanation of our mural on America during the 1960s.